and good afternoon. My name is Kay Wallis, and I'm a Richmond resident and a health educator and co-founder of the Richmond Progressive Alliance. And it's been my pleasure and privilege to be asked to help moderate and facilitate this session today, working coast to coast, making cities and states sustainable and free from oil dependency. So if that's the workshop that you are interested in, you are in the right place. So we're very pleased to be welcoming two very special speakers on this topic, and I'll introduce them in a second. Just to give you a sense of how our 45 minutes or so will go, we'll hear from Gayle McLaughlin first for a brief presentation, and then we'll hear from David Zuckerman next, and then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion before we close. Okay? So let me introduce Gayle McLaughlin, who is the former mayor of Richmond, where we are right now, and also two and a half terms on the Richmond City Council. Hi, welcome. During her tenure on the council, Gayle led a remarkable progressive transformation of Richmond. It was a decade, really, that saw the iron grip of Chevron released from city government after many, many decades of having it the other way. Wonderful accomplishments like a 75% reduction in homicides during that time, the establishment of rent control, the raising of the minimum wage, and strong support for green jobs and sustainable development. So it's been, now she didn't do it all by herself, but she was a tremendous leader and visionary for a grassroots movement that made this all possible. So Gayle, in June 2017, Gayle left the City Council to devote herself full-time to statewide organizing and activating, and also a campaign for the Lieutenant Governor of the state of California for next year's election. So that's very exciting. Let's hear for about 10 minutes or so some of Gayle's thoughts on oil-free communities and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. So thanks so much, Kay, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be here. It's great to be here at the Soil Not Oil Conference, which was something that started, or at least we started hosting it in Richmond when I was mayor. So I'm so glad it's continuing, and we are gaining so many wonderful people coming together. So I want to just start out. Kay did a great introduction. I'm the two-term mayor of Richmond and the first corporate-free council member of the Richmond Progressive Alliance. Richmond, I'm going to share a little bit about what the Richmond Progressive Alliance is, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the sustainability accomplishments and just focus then on where we're at and where we need to go. So, first of all, the RPA is an inclusive, diverse, year-round, progressive, corporate-free organization, and we came together in 2003. We came together based on our progressive values. We had had enough. We were activists in the community, and speaking out at the public podium, sharing our values, sharing our views on policies, and what was happening is it was falling on deaf ears. So we decided we needed to be the leaders we were waiting for and run for office. So the RPA came about to build that local political power and to run candidates for local office without any corporate money. And so that was the start of it. I was the first corporate-free council member that was elected in 2004, and then I was elected mayor in 2006 and re-elected in 2010. Ran for council again and served for 2.5 years until I resigned for this campaign for lieutenant governor. And it's great to be here with David, who is a current, and what Bernie Sanders says is the most progressive lieutenant governor in the country. So I'm excited to be here with him. So let me go on to share where things were at. So before RPA came along, the entire city council was either purchased by Chevron or intimidated by Chevron. So we knew we had to do something. We had many environmental groups that were activists in the city, West County Toxics Coalition, Communities for a Better Environment, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and they were doing great work. And they got some things accomplished, but again, most of the time it was falling on deaf ears. So once the RPA came about, we of course were connecting with these activist groups, and we were forming a stronger network of people standing up to this big oil refinery in our city that has been polluting our community for since it started 100 years ago. So we stood up to Chevron in many, many ways. One of the things that happened, and the environmental groups were really the start of all of this, we got flare reduction. Flare reduction at the refinery was very important because they were using flaring for anything that, any choice that they wanted to, when it should only be used for emergencies. And we knew we had to regulate them, and we had to get more taxes from them because the city of Richmond was not getting its fair share of taxes from this big multi-billionaire billionaire oil company in our city limits. So of course, like I said, the main thing we had to do was get people elected. So one of our major accomplishments through the RPA was, as of this last November, we have won 5 out of 7 council seats without any corporate money. So that's a super majority. We also did things like we defeated a bad project. And again, I'm going to say the environmental groups, the environmental justice groups were the ones who did this. The council majority passed a really bad Chevron expansion project that would have caused more harm, more health problems, more risk to our community. And so the EIR was very flawed, the Environmental Impact Report. But the council majority passed it, and I was in the minority opposing it. And what happened was the EJ groups took Chevron and the city to court, and the EJ groups won. So the project stopped. And then Chevron had to start bringing forward a new project, which eventually they brought forward in 2014. A better project, a smaller project. We got some regulations. The council majority, again, we still didn't have that majority on the council yet, would not approve the kind of regulations that we wanted. But we did get a better project than it was. So let me tell you why we need to regulate Chevron. Chevron is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the state of California. And along with the greenhouse gas emissions come many other toxins. I mean, there's the CAPs, which are the criteria air pollutants. There's the TACs, which are the toxic air contaminants. These are what we're breathing in. This is what people, especially on the fence line, and it's a low-income community. Richmond itself is a very low-income, working-class community. This is something people breathe in and day out. So, and not only does it impact Richmond, it really the pollution spreads out into the Central Valley. I mean, it's really a big problem for California as a whole. So we really knew and still are trying to regulate this big refinery. We have among the highest rates of asthma in the state. And so one of the things that we tried to do is work with the Air District, the Bay Area Quality Air District, to get them to put a cap on emissions and then reduce the emissions as years go on. And great progress was being made on that. But then our governor, Jerry Brown, who gets money from the oil companies, proceeds to, cap and trade is a policy that is a state policy that allows for pollution trading. In other words, it allows oil companies to pollute communities as long as they do some mitigations elsewhere. So cap and trade was passed at the state level a few years back, which we opposed because our community still gets the pollution. But then it was renewed just recently by Jerry Brown in the legislature. And the renewal project was even worse because it took the power, it took the regulatory power away from regional regulators like the Air District and away from municipalities. And you know, so all our work with the air district to get them to cap the emissions and then start lowering them was for naught, because it passed. The legislature passed this bad policy. So it goes to that's one of the reasons why you need corporate-free elected officials, so that they don't pass these bad policies and pretend they're being environmentalists like Jerry Brown and others do. We also did things like, because we know the environmental struggle, and I know David talked about this in his talk earlier, dovetails with the economic struggle. Bernie Sanders talked about this a lot. We knew this, and know this still, that Chevron should be paying more taxes to the community. And one thing we were able to get was $114 million in additional taxes from Chevron over 15 years. So this was a big community victory, and you know, as mayor I pushed for it, but I had to be in communication and working side by side with the community, because it takes that pressure of a movement. And we still didn't have a majority on the council, so we had to impact the non-RPA council members. Let me see what else. I want to rush a little bit here. So in 2012, and I'm talking a lot about Chevron, I'll talk about a couple other things as well, but in 2012 we had a major fire in the Chevron refinery. Many of you remember 15,000 people went to local hospitals for respiratory treatment. Well, that was a major thing for our community, for other communities, for California as a whole. We live with this risk. We're suing Chevron now as a result of it, and we're going to get compensation for our community, and we're pushing them to be a safer refinery, because we need it to be the safest, cleanest refinery while it's still operating, even though eventually we want them to transform away from fossil fuels. I mean, that has to be the goal. So I want to share that in terms of how we address the pressure on big corporations like Chevron, it really does take massive amounts of people. And in 2013, on the year anniversary of the Chevron fire, we had 3,000 people marching from the Richmond BART, which is our transport system here in the Bay Area, all the way to the Chevron refinery. So people rallied around Richmond and our environmental justice struggle. And we're grateful for that, and we continue to showcase that we're on the front lines, yes, of environmental injustice, but also of environmental justice and pushing back. And we know that individuals have a role in shifting away from this climate chaos that we're in right now. I mean, and as mayor, I put forward many good policies, and the city council passed them. Things like bike paths, community gardens. We have a huge community garden program in Richmond. Affordable housing around public transit, solar job training. We have a world-renowned solar job training program. Solar rebates. I was part of the mayor's climate action agreement. However, we know that we want to keep encouraging individuals to do the right thing, ride their bikes and take public transit. But it's really a minuscule amount if we don't regulate these oil companies. It's really not, it's like we'll be going down on the Titanic, right? Maybe we'll have a greener deck on the Titanic as we go down, but we're still going down unless we get these, at the same time as we do our part individually, we have to do our part in building a movement to push back on these oil companies. So we can't expect the oil companies to do it. We know they put profits first, and they're going to do that forever. And the planet will go down before they ever realize that their profits should come before, or should come after the planet's, at least, and the people's rights. And we know also that our federal government, which withdrew from the Paris Agreement, is not going to do it for us. And we know that our state government, our state legislature, stands right with our governor right now in giving us bad policies. So we know it's not coming from them. It's got to come from us. And We're in this catastrophic free fall period now with the Trump administration, but it's also a key time for organizing. And we can organize coast to coast, you know. We really need to showcase, like as a candidate for Lieutenant Governor, I'm going to be pushing forward, and I've visited, you know, around 50 cities already, encouraging local political action from the grassroots, building progressive alliances like the RPA. And we want to make sure that we're connected with the good work that is happening throughout the country. And of course, you know, in Vermont, there's some great stuff happening. So I'll end there, and thank you all for your attention.
All right, thank you, Gayle. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, a lot of the initiatives and struggles and achievements gained Richmond national media attention. So it's an easy Google search to see what kind of attention was promoted by those great projects. All right, so our next speaker is David Zuckerman, who is your keynote speaker here at the conference, and he is, of course, Lieutenant Governor in the state of Vermont, the beautiful state of Vermont. Originally from Massachusetts, he went to the University of Vermont as an environmental studies major. He served in the Vermont House of Representatives and as a state senator. And he's the co-owner of an organic vegetable farm in Heinsberg, Vermont, called Full Moon Farm. And he's here to offer his perspectives from the East Coast about sustainable futures and freedom from oil dependency. So thank you. Welcome.
Well, thank you, and thanks for another opportunity to speak with you all. And I hope it was okay earlier for those of you that were in the room. I don't even know where to begin necessarily, but it's just the opportunity to come out here. Steve Early's here, and he wrote the book Refinery Town, or did I get that right? Really talking about some of the struggle and history with Chevron's dominance of the political system here in town, and some of the work that Gayle and the RPA has done fighting back. And so I want to thank Steve for inviting me, or helping get me invited to be a part of this conference. And there's so many sort of symbiotic things going on, even though it's just sort of like quantum physics. We don't actually fully know that each other exists and whatnot, but we are impacting each other nonetheless, right? For those of you that are in the scientific mindset. I was a chemistry major at first, actually, when I went to UVM. And I changed to environmental studies, which wasn't all in there, so there's no way for you to know that. After being an activist at UVM for about a year and a half on various environmental issues, I realized that my cost and tuition for going to higher education was pretty significant relative to what I was getting out of it, and thought it might be better for me to take a year off and figure out do some soul searching and figure out what I was going to do in life. And I hiked the Appalachian Trail. And I returned to UVM, and while I was gone, they had implemented a new shuttle bus system to transport students from the dorms to the main campus and so forth. And I was sort of shocked. I was like, well, I just walked 2,000 miles. I think I could probably walk a half a mile to get to class. And I also thought, wow, you know, a lot of the students that come here from out of state come here because of the skiing, because of the hiking, because of the outdoor scenario of Vermont and what it all represents at the University of the Green Mountains, Universitas Verdes Montes, if you're ever wondering why Vermont, which is VT, is UVM, is the Latin. And so I worked with many other students on campus to protest and fight against the shuttle bus system, which even with 1,000 signatures from campus and others, and meeting with the former governor of Vermont and then president of the university, was not able to really get them to remove it, because apparently it had been some agreement with the city on housing stuff. But it really was an interesting struggle to be fighting against mass transportation. I mean, in some ways, right? So as a 1992, I'm a 21-year-old, don't quite comprehend everything student fighting this moment, this thing. But even so, I fight very much for public transportation and mass transportation, but we also have to, where those of us can walk or bike or are able to not use fossil fuel at all, we need to also create appropriate systems. So I just was an activist and continued to be after hiking the trail, but through school learned about GMOs and various things and just got engaged. And as I said in there, Bernie, opened up my eyes to the world of electoral politics. And what we've done in Vermont in that time is I met some of the folks of the Progressive Coalition. And the Progressive Coalition was electing city councilors in Burlington to work with Mayor Sanders in the 80s and then Peter Clavell in the 90s, and really working on a lot of forefront policy ideas like no spraying of herbicides on our public parks and on the rail lines going through our city. And to think about that happening in the 80s and early 90s was fairly ahead of the curve. So I was fortunate enough to be able to be walking in the footsteps of real true leaders who were ahead of the curve in many ways. And I now, as an elected official, feel like the movement is out there. I get to be a spokesperson for it, but I am not the creative innovator of the changes that need to happen. I just get to be a spokesperson for so many of these great ideas that many of you come up with. But in Vermont, we've done a number of things. Not that Vermont had a lot of fracked gas in the ground, but we've passed a no fracking in Vermont law. But then, of course, our natural gas company also put an extension of their fracked gas pipeline into other parts of the state, which is gas from Canada. So we are not so perfect as some might think, but we are continuing to make progress. And over time, we've actually elected now, I think it's 6 current progressives in the legislature and the House, and 5 senators out of 30 are affiliated with the Progressive Party. I am now, I believe, the highest elected third-party elected official in the country, but I also ran in the Democratic primary and won that to alleviate the 3-way race conundrum, but now can be speaking out about sustainable practices. And as an organic farmer, again, you heard me talking about that in there, continuing those practices around the state. We have a tremendous organic agriculture network in Vermont, so when it comes to shifting away from carbon being emitted to putting carbon in the ground, a lot of organic farmers are also obviously regenerative. But on the state level, I think we've done a number of different things that move us in this direction. We have the Vermont Land Trust and the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which every year gets revenue from the property transfer tax. I believe it's 0.25% on property transfers, goes into a fund that has a state nonprofit appointed board, of which about half the money goes to affordable housing and half the money goes towards buying development rights on farms so that land will be perpetually affordable for agriculture. And you might think, how is that related to oil? But it is related to oil. I mean, the more you develop in suburban sprawl, the more people are driving longer distances to work versus trying to focus development in more concentrated areas and then keeping more land open to both produce food and reduce that commuting scenario. In Burlington, I was on the Burlington Electric Commission after I lost my first race for the House, and we cut off our ties to Vermont Yankee, and over time, Burlington Electric Commission, which is a public utility, is now 100% renewable energy. Some of it is some larger scale hydro, so that's debatable, but as a whole, you're debating some pretty fine points there relative to gas facilities and so forth. And BED and Green Mountain Power built in the 80s a wood chip, at the time the largest wood chip plant in the country in Burlington. And so it was right in the community that was using the power, and we weren't exporting necessarily all of our polluting situation to others, which is not exactly the situation here, where everybody else's use of oil is exporting the pollution onto your community. So it's a different scale and a different discussion. But in part, we do have to be responsible for what we use, and we can't just send our problem into other people's backyards. We have a reasonably robust public transportation system for such a small population of people, but we have a long way to go. There's discussions of a carbon pollution tax, and at least that conversation is happening. It's an important conversation to have, but it's really important to make sure as we do these environmental battles that we weigh and make sure to incorporate economic justice issues. When you have a lot of low-income rural areas where people have to drive a long way to get to work or to make a living, as you look at a carbon pollution tax, you've got to make sure you either compensate financially or make sure there's much better public transportation or other methods of economic remuneration as implementing such things, and there's a lot of really good thought going on there. I've actually formed what we call a Blue-Green Alliance in my office, where I've called in a lot of the labor organizations and the environmental organizations, and we're having meetings every few months to say, okay, what is your agenda and what is your agenda? How do we make sure each isn't at conflict with the other, and where can we then even be in concert? And actually by the end of this year, as our governor was attacking our teachers' healthcare system and contracts, trying to make it a statewide contract instead of a locally negotiated part of collective bargaining, we actually had environmental leaders standing out at the rallies and protests in solidarity. And now hopefully in the future we'll have also labor leaders standing with us at our environmental events and trying to break down some of that historical green-blue divide that I think has really created divisions that we don't need to have with respect to the working class struggle and the environmental struggle. And I will, I think I'm going to get the signal soon, but I also just want to mention that our state funds and supports things like farm-to-family coupons and crop cash, which are ways to make EBT dollars go farther and WIC coupons go farther. EBT, SNAP benefits, changes all the time, but low-income food stamps, where you get actually a 2-for-1 if you turn them into crop cash dollars that you use at your farmers market vendors. And the farmer market vendors, they count as full dollars, but the person with financial challenges gets each week for $5 of EBT stamps, they can get $10 of vegetables or farm fresh food. And so it helps get more local and, in my case, organic food into people's mouths and families and seniors that so desperately need healthy food to help combat so many of the other disadvantages that one sometimes has. And that may not feel directly related to oil and fossil fuel, but it's part of just the economic shift of economic justice. And as someone is more able to feed their family well, then they may have more dollars to potentially have to make some sort of environmental decision and environmental purchase. As I mentioned in the other room, in some form or another, I can't remember my speech exactly, you know, you're not going to buy recycled toilet paper when you can't pay the electric bill and you can't put enough food on your plate, much less buying a Prius or putting solar panels on your roof. And so if we can address different elements of environmental injustice, then we'll also be addressing over time many of the oil, fossil fuel, and climate injustices that we have. True with universal health care, minimum wage, paid family leave. We have one of the highest statewide minimum wages in the country. It's $10 an hour, and we're now in a discussion around the fight for 15. In this coming session, I'm quite certain we'll pass a bill. Our governor will have to decide what he's going to do with it. We have a New England Republican governor, which is different than some other Republicans, but it's still hard to get a minimum wage bill passed and signed. But again, continuing to incrementally increase the minimum wage, because again, when people are on better financial footing, I think they have more opportunity to do that which they want to do. And I think it's really important that we don't shame people who are already struggling, and then add guilt to that and shaming when they're just struggling to get through each day and they're struggling to provide for their children and their spouses. And that we have to address, as I said in there, many of these economic struggles if we want to build our coalition more broadly to really take on a change of our economy from one that's fossil fuel based to one that's regenerative based. And so we are having those discussions in Vermont. We have not passed all those laws yet, but minimum wage will be coming up this year. Paid family leave passed the House last year. We hope to move something in the Senate this year. And with universal health care, we weren't able to pull it off when we had passed the law a few years ago. The governor ended up pulling the plug on it, but we are now looking at discussions on universal primary care to at least again set that foundation and start broadening towards a universal health care system over time through people becoming familiar with that. So I go on these tangents, but it is ultimately all related. We cannot win the fossil fuel battles without economic justice. Thank you. And if anybody wants, there's a Progressive Party button if you want to pin, excuse me. And I'm going to pass around, not that you really want to know what's going on in Vermont politics all the time, but I only send one out about once a month or every few weeks during the session. But a newsletter sign up and there's a hard copy of what the newsletter looks like if you are interested in learning more about what I do and what Vermont politicians are fighting about.
Beautiful. I've lived in California my whole life. I've never heard a lieutenant governor say things like this. So this is exciting. So we have time. We have a few minutes for some questions. I want to make a quick announcement, just so it doesn't get lost when we start to disperse at the end, that there's a party tomorrow here in Richmond that everyone's invited to. Steve has flyers for it, and both of our distinguished speakers will be there. Ostensibly, it's a celebration and fundraiser for Gayle's Lieutenant Governor campaign. It's at the home of Steve Early in Point Richmond. All the details are on the flyer, but it would be another opportunity to keep this wonderful discussion going, all right? And so is there a question in the back? Please.
So I've spoken with both Lieutenant Governor and aspiring Lieutenant Governor Gayle McLaughlin, and thank you so much to both of you for your public service. I wish all of our elected officials were as ethical as you both are, so thank you so much. I just wanted to raise a couple of things. One is, I'm in Portland, where we passed a resolution for net new fossil fuel infrastructure, and thank you, Gayle, for endorsing that for the city of Richmond. We're now, thanks to Seattle, passing a similar resolution that we call it for new fossil fuel infrastructure. We're setting our sights bigger statewide. Seattle said the entire state of Washington should go for the new fossil fuel infrastructure. And one of the other campaigns that you've also endorsed, thank you, Gayle, is to take no money from the fossil fuel industry. So that is a national campaign that includes 350 and Friends of the Earth and others. But I just wanted to put that out there, that the two, to me, are intimately connected. If you're not taking money from the fossil fuel industry, you're more inclined to pledge to build a progressive alliance of elected officials for no new fossil fuel infrastructure. So I'm going to put out there for both of you, as Lieutenant Governor and future Lieutenant Governor, would you like to work on a campaign for no new fossil fuel infrastructure for both states, Vermont and California?
I definitely would do so. I think it's needed, and we are pressed for time to keep the planet from destroying itself, or us destroying it. So yes, I would definitely.
Yeah, and we did speak earlier, and I'm more than happy to try to connect you with both organizations in Vermont and elected leaders on the Natural Resources, Energy, and Economic Development Committees to look at that kind of idea and get the proposals going. And you know, one of the things that I think is really important to recognize is that, for instance, back when Vermont had passed civil unions, and I was one of 22 votes for marriage equality at the time, it was still land-breaking legislation because no state had done anything through legislature when it did civil unions. But then it was a few years later that I introduced marriage equality, and nobody thought marriage equality was going to go anywhere. But when you introduce the bill, it gives something for people to organize around. And so even if the possibility of legislation may not happen right away, if we can get a legislator to introduce these ideas so that people can have rational and deliberative discussions about what it means and what the impacts would be, positive and or negative, for the state, then you have the opportunity to have those deliberations. And one of the folks that works on my farm, he and I were chatting the other day, and he said, you know, as I was telling him about how many times I give that example of, you know, 15 minutes a week or 30 minutes a week of participating in democracy, he said, and that it's not just voting every 2 years or voting every 4 years. He said, you know, the thing that makes democracy great is not the act of voting, but it's the deliberation. And he wanted me to always make sure to give him credit for that. So Amos gets credit for that. But it's hard to even have those deliberations and discussions without there being a bill number or a topic that's out there where the media pays attention to it and gets it into the broader lexicon so that people start having these discussions over coffee and tea. What does it mean to truly shift our economy away from a fossil fuel infrastructure-based economy? And so certainly happy to help connect that and have those discussions.
So I saw two hands, one here, and then we'll go to you, and then we'll go over here. Okay, please, and stand up so we can hear.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could comment on what you think about the value of a revenue neutral fee on carbon in terms terms of taking us where we want to go from here?
I'll start by saying I support that. I know, are you working on that? Yeah, I know the carbon fee, and then it won't impact the community dividend free, so that there's like a rebate or something for the residents. Go to the residents. Right. So I think that's an excellent bill. I'm also standing in my campaign for an oil severance tax, which every other major oil producing state in the nation has a tax on extraction, oil extraction. And we don't in California. Now, we don't want any more, for Daphne, if she's still here, any more extraction or any more fossil fuel infrastructure, period. But as long as there is operations going on, we should get tax money from it, and we should turn that tax money into renewables, solarize the whole state. But I think that carbon fee, that dividend fee carbon tax, yeah. I've read up on it, and it sounds like an excellent idea, so I'm actually talking about it a little bit in my campaign. So, but I would rely on experts like you, people that are working on these important issues. That's what grassroots building, movement building is all about. Elected officials like David, like I have been, and like I will be as Lieutenant Governor, working with the community experts rather than the corporate experts. That's how we're going to build from the grassroots.
Well, and in Vermont, this was actually a pretty hot topic in the last election cycle, because the idea of a carbon pollution tax had been floated and introduced, and we had many discussions about it. And I really welcome that conversation and making sure that we do have a dividend system that, again, going back to the theme I've talked about many times, that our working class and economically challenged individuals don't get chopped off at the knees. And that's the hardest thing, is making sure that we articulate that message well. The groups in Vermont that were promoting it and supporting it got slapped back pretty hard with the counter, it's all messaging, and the counter message was pretty aggressive and pretty difficult. And so they're regrouping and talking again about framing it better, and because it's when you look at the details, working people don't get chopped off at the knees. But when it's so easy for the topic to be spun that they are, and they're working 50, 60 hours a week to pay their bills, and their access to information is sometimes not as broad as others, the sound bites hurt us. And so we have to really make sure that our efforts on the campaign side are well thought out and ready to go, and ready to counter some of the propaganda that comes out from the other side. And we're facing years of people's cynicism where government has not helped them, because government has been represented on both parties by corporate interests. And so even when some of the folks elected to office have good intentions and good values, the policies from top down and the leadership and the direction from the Speaker's office or the Pro Tem's office haven't always come through to really help everyday working people. So we have to build that trust in order to pass those kinds of ideas.
Yeah, I think the risk of that kind of policy is that at the ninth hour, the funds don't go revenue neutral.
Right.
They get put into projects that politicians want to see happen, and that's going to be part of that policy.
That's right.
Thank you for that exchange. We have two more people who raised their hands, and we're getting close to the 5:15 time, and I think there's another event. Oh, okay. There's another event here at 5:15, so we probably can't spill over, at least in the room.
Right.
So quickly here, and then we'll try our best to get there. Please.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be that quick because it's a bit complicated. So first of all, I really appreciate your work. It's really inspirational, and so I feel a bit curmudgeonly in saying the comments that I want to, because I want to take more of an international perspective and the impact of the US, regardless of whether it's Republican or Democratic, on hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers around the world who are negatively being impacted by US food and farm policies, by corporations. And if there's pushback on a corporation like Chevron, many of the corporations, if they're prevented operating in one place, they'll just go somewhere else. And there's very clear documentation that when they're prevented in Europe or North America they'll just move their business of, you know, drugs or tobacco or whatever, they'll go to Africa or they'll go to South Asia. And I think the thing that I'm really concerned about is how the progressive movement in this country is not connecting with progressive movements in other parts of the world to really join forces and say, you know, we have to fight together, or we have to work together to really limit or overcome corporations. And I think I'm British, I'm a US citizen. I come from a background of the British Empire and understanding what the movements have been for independence and liberation against the British, who had these, you know, octopus fingers around the world, just as corporations do. And you often have to have an alliance of partners and movements that aren't just within the country. It's almost impossible to bring about huge change. So my question is, how do you deal with that? You're dealing, you know, you're on the front line of making change within your own communities and your own states, but how do you actually not just move the problem to some other part of the world?
Well, I think there has to be some sense of and discussion of the reality of what each state can do relative to how our government works with international versus state laws. I also would argue that both climate change and human rights issues have drawn people together all around the world, including many United States citizens. But you know, I would also say we are both very limited. I literally, in the Lieutenant Governor's Office of Vermont, have a staff of one person. Okay, I don't know what you had as a city council, but you know,
council is 0.
Right. So you know, I think we have
right?
to give some allowance for how much can one person or two people do, and you have to work to improve as holistically in your home area as you can, and holistically includes trying to think about what externalizing those scenarios are. As I said earlier with the wood chip plant, we put the wood chip plant in Burlington. We didn't put it in eastern Vermont where, you know, any smoke or soot would go affect other people. So you try, you know, you have to be conscious of it, and you do have to collaborate when and where you can. I mean, 350.org is all over the world.
Yeah. And quickly, and then I think we'll have to adjourn because I got the signal.
Okay, so I just want to say that when I was mayor in Richmond, I really did extend to the extent I could into the international struggle. For example, we united with an Australian union that is fighting Chevron. We also united with the Ecuadorian struggle against Chevron, the indigenous community. That the rainforest in Ecuador was devastated, the Ecuadorian portion, and the indigenous community's health suffered, you know, incredibly. I actually went to Ecuador at the invitation of the Ecuadorian president and saw that that horrendous devastation. So I guess what I'm saying is I agree with what David's saying is that we're limited, but also people are coming together, and that we are part of a global family. You know, we're all brothers and sisters in this global family.
And this helps.
And yeah, right, it's communication helps with cell phones and such, and we really it needs to be an international struggle. So you're very, very right on that. So we have to find ways to connect whenever we can.